All right, we're continuing our study on parenting. And if you're following in the workbook, we're on page 63. If you don't have a workbook, we'll have the bulk of the material on the screen before you. Today we're talking about stones and serpents. We'll get to that in just a second. We're in lesson 13 overall, but 11 in the workbook. And we have 17 lessons in all, so we're quickly getting toward the end. So we're in lesson 11, page 63, if you're following in the workbook. This is not in the workbook. This is a rule we give each time, and this is rule number 18. If you're trying to keep up with those and jot those down. These are simple rules, basic rules of parenting. And this is a simple rule of parenting. Teach your children to take responsibility for their actions. Teach your children to take responsibility for their actions. If you don't, they'll grow up to be adults that believe nothing is ever their fault. You agree with that? Is that true? We have a world full of people where the adults think nothing is their fault. They grow up in a household where it was always the teacher's fault. They didn't do well in school. It's the coach's fault. They didn't do well on the team. It's their siblings' fault as to why they got in trouble and on down the line. And so they grow up in that environment where they never take responsibility for their action. And now they're adults and it's always somebody else's fault. They take no responsibility. So teach your children to take responsibility for their actions. We may talk more about that a little bit later if time permits, how we do that. But let's move further. We have some ground to cover. All right, we're on page 63 now, and let's give some introductory information, and then why do we call this lesson Stones and Serpents, and having to do with giving gifts. It's based on Matthew 7, if you haven't read ahead. The family is the nucleus of civilization. We all agree with that as the family goes, so goes the nation and society. And so you look around in our society and you see a corrupt society, that's because the family has become corrupt. If all families were what they are supposed to be, we would not have a corrupt society. It's the nucleus of civilization. Our author makes a point that tragically families in America are disintegrating. In his statistics, which are a little bit old, but they're not very far off for the current scene, and I'll give you a little more about that in just a second, that only 45% of all teens in ages 13 to 18 live with their married biological father and mother. You stop and think about that. Less than half of the teenagers in America are living with their father and their mother. Now, some of that can't be helped, I recognize. There may be a death that takes place. But 45% less than half live with their biological father and mother. 24% of teens live in some sort of single-parent home. This is not in your workbook. This is a statistic as of 2020 from the CDC, unmarried childbearing. I'm interested in the last of those. The percent of all births to unmarried women is 40.5%. 40.5% of the births are to unmarried women. Now you think about that, about the impact that has on the home and the family. Our author goes on to point out that the lesson to be learned from all of that is that parents need to stabilize their marriage so that they can have a good home for rearing and the raising of their children. Now the two passages he cites don't really use the word stabilize, doesn't really talk about raising children, but it talks about the permanence of marriage, like in Matthew 19, 4-6. That can a man divorce his wife just for any cause? And Jesus 4 times answered that, saying no. All right, now let's go to Matthew chapter 7, if you will. In your Bibles, this is in the Sermon on the Mount. Parents want to give their children good gifts. All of us do that. There's not a parent here, either future parent or present, or if your children are raised and grown and you say, I don't have little children anymore, you still have this concept, or did when their children were small, I want to give them good gifts. Well, that's one of the things we learn here from Matthew 7. This is in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, and Jesus is making a point in chapter 7. And his point that he's making in chapter 7 is that the message of the kingdom has everything to do with our relationship to man. And his point beginning at verse 6 is that we need to be gracious to others as God is to us. So let's see what he says. He said, or what man is there? Now this is not the whole context, obviously. What man is there among you who, if his son asked for bread, would he give him a stone? That's a rhetorical question. Who in his right mind, if his son came to him and said, Dad, I want a piece of bread, would he give him a stone? Here's a rock. Or if he asked for a fish, would he give him a serpent? What dad whose child comes to him and said, Dad, I'm craving fish. Can we go get fish? Well, yeah, we'll go get something. And he goes and buys him a snake. No rightly minded father would do that. If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? So here's the point. Be gracious as God is gracious to you. God is gracious to you, so you be gracious to others. That's the context in the Sermon on the Kingdom. That's the point that he's making. God gives good gifts to those who ask of him. And so likewise, no man would give a serpent or a stone to a child that asks for food. You wouldn't do that. Not at all. However, here's the point to be made from this context. However, there are many times we are giving serpents and stones to our children. There's not a one of us would think of literally handing a rattlesnake and giving it to your child. You wanted something? You asked for a fish? Well, here's what I'll give you. I'll give you a rattlesnake. Here's your copperhead. Nor would you give them a stone instead of giving them bread to eat. We wouldn't think of that. But in a more spiritual sense, there are times when our children are craving and asking for something, we're giving them things they don't need. And that's what this study is about. Here they are. Our author lists 6 things. Sometimes our children ask for time and we give them things instead. Sometimes our children ask for discipline. Now, they may not come to us, but they're crying out for discipline, and yet we ignore the problem. Sometimes they ask for guidance and we leave them unrestricted, leave them to themselves. Sometimes they're looking for spiritual focus and we give them pleasure instead. They're asking for praise and compliments and we give them criticism. They ask for stability and we give them nothing but chaos. I like what our author's done with that. That is the picture of the problem in the home. You agree? All right, let's get underway. Let's talk about page 63 now. They ask for time and we give them things. Here's a passage or two that say the same thing. Colossians 4 or Ephesians 5. Parallel books, parallel passages that we've cited many times. And our point to be made here is how we use our time reflects our values and our interest and our commitment. Let's take the text first. What does the text say in summary? Just we need to redeem the time, which means make the best use of our time. Use your time wisely. You only have a limited amount of time, and so you use your time very wisely. That's the point. Now, how is this true, the statement true, that how we use our time reflects our values and our interest and our commitment? Pretty simple. Same thing with your money. If I looked at your checkbook and you had it all divided out by this is what I spent on food, this is what I spent on pleasure, this is what I spent on vacation, this is what I spent on my hobby, this is what I spent on spiritual interest, it wouldn't take me long to figure out where your interests really are, would it? And you looking at the same at mine. Well, is that not also true if we put our time in a checkbook or some kind of spreadsheet? This is where I spent my time. Does that be true? So if I spend a great deal of time in sports, nothing wrong with that, that tells me where my interest and my commitment is. If I spend a great deal of time with work, that's where my interest and my commitment is. If I spend a great deal of time with my children, that's where my commitment is. Make sense? All right, let's go further. Things do not substitute for parental time. Would you agree with that? Being a parent takes time. You can't be a good parent and rear and train and nurture your children and fulfill any of the commands that God gives for rearing children without spending time. Time that we have now can never be recovered. What do we mean by that? That's from our workbook. Our author made that point. I agree. What does he mean by that?
Same thing, we talked about earlier in our studies, talking about children while they're young. There comes a point in time where it's too late.
Too late, exactly. Yeah, the time you have now can never be recovered. It's not like you can say, well, I need to spend time with my children. I know they're young, but I'm going to do that later when I get through with this project I'm working on, or I make a little more money. I get some money set back, I accomplish this, or I do that. Then I'm going to spend time with my children. You never recover that time. It's gone. It's lost. It takes time to be a parent. James chapter 4, how does it relate to this? Verses 13 and 14. There may not be a tomorrow. Yeah, what you're planning to do with your children another day, another time, but not now, I don't have time, you may not have that time. Your children may not live. You may not live. There may not be a tomorrow. So the point here is the brevity of life should drive us to our children. Does that make sense? I realize life is short. Life is brief. They'll be gone in a heartbeat. And so that should drive us to our children to spend time with them and the training and the rearing and the teaching and the instruction of our children. All right, we're still on page 63, developing point 1. This is the longest point he has in the workbook. Worldly mindset, that worldly concept, has impacted the home. How? There's one main point our author is making right here. This worldly thinking, that's what I mean by worldly mindset. The worldly thinking like the world. I don't mean that you're involved in sin and you're involved in drinking and drugs. That's not the worldliness I'm talking about. It's just thinking like the world, thinking rather than spiritual, thinking more carnal. That kind of concept has robbed children of their parents. Because parents have bought into the concept that says, yeah, I want to spend quality time with my kids. I don't need to spend a lot of time, but what time I do spend, it may be very limited, but it's going to be quality time. I like what our author made the point number 3 here. No child ever talks about quality time. Have you ever heard a young child say, I just want to spend a little quality time. I don't want to spend a lot with Dad. I just want some quality time. I never heard a child say that, and you hadn't either. No child talks like that. I like what dear Abby said. If you want your child to turn out well, spend twice as much time with them and half as much money. Don't worry so much about the money. We begin to think that worldly things can replace us, and so I'm just going to give a little slice, a small slice of quality time. What I want to suggest about that, this idea of quality time doesn't satisfy the child. It satisfies the parents' guilty conscience. Bingo. Exactly. I feel guilty for not spending time with my child, but if I can label this time as quality, better than I would have otherwise, I feel better about my lack of diligence with reference to my children. Make sense? All right. Takes time. Now, some people have shifted time to others, the time responsibility. In other words, it takes time. Somebody's got to spend time with the children. And there are some parents who have shifted that over to somebody else. How so? All right, somebody else raising the child, somebody else teaching the child, somebody spending all the time, most of the day with the child. This concept of the daycare society or it takes a village mentality is what has shifted that responsibility. And what we suggest here is it takes time and care and attention to be a mommy and a daddy. And so if you want to be a good mama, be a good daddy, it takes time with your children. And that's time that can never be recovered. You can't delay that and say, well, you know what? I want to do this, but I'm going to wait and do that a little bit later. That time will never come back. Dr. Laura Schlesinger said, one doesn't have to be a religious fundamentalist to consider the nurturing of children of vital interest to our society. Yet women have gladly opened their arms to embrace the hideous lie that hired help is in any way equivalent to a loving mother in raising of the children. You agree with that? That's a lie. Up and down, Jess, back and forth, no. I agree with that. That is buying into a lie. That's not to say that if you put your child in daycare for a small period of time that you have done anything wrong. That's not the point they're making. It's the concept that hired help is equivalent to the mother. You can't hire anybody to do the job that a mother can do for her own child. be it grandparents or anybody else. Nobody else can do the job that mom can do with those children. Would you agree with that? Because that's the plan that God sets forth. All right, we're still developing this idea of they ask for time and we give them things. Godly parents invest time in their children. And we cite the case of Hannah. Your workbook, if you want to make a correction in that, is 1 Samuel chapter 1 instead of chapter 2. Your workbook has 1 Samuel chapter 2. So let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 1 and see the point to be made in 1 Samuel chapter 1. The point is about Hannah. Her primary interest was in the care of her child. The author mentions a couple of things there about that. What does he say about that? At 1 Samuel chapter 1, beginning at verse 20. That when she has the child, if you found the references on page, if you want to make a correction in your workbook, it's on the top of page 64, second column. Second line, you'll see Hannah as an example of a mother whose primary interest is the care of the young child, 1 Samuel. That should be chapter 1 right there. And the next reference, 4 or 5 lines later, should be chapter 1 again. All right, he makes 2 points. The author makes 2 points. The first one was she chose with the annual feast to stay with the child until the child was weaned. Remember that? Look at that at verse 20. 1 Samuel chapter 1, beginning at verse 20. That when Hannah did not go up, let's look at verse 21. That when Elkanah and all of his house went up to offer the yearly sacrifice with the vow, but Hannah did not go up, saying, I will not go up until the child is weaned. So she stays with him, spends time with him. That's the point our author is making, and that's the point we're trying to glean from that text. Then there was a second thing our author points out. From verse 24 to 25, she later brought the child. Say again? Before the Lord, yeah. She comes and presents him before the Lord, showing her emphasis is on the child. Her emphasis is on what's best for the child, her interest in the child. There are other godly mothers that are mentioned in the Bible, be it Naomi, Jochebed, or Lois, or Eunice, or Mary, whoever else we might find. But what we're learning from that is parents need to spend time if they want to steer them in the direction of godliness. Does that make sense? We're after time here. Children need your time, not your things. Now, let's look at another passage or two. Let's look at 1 Timothy chapter 6. We need to be careful that we not make material things an emphasis. Well, look at the passages. You can help me with those. But here's the point we're trying to learn from this. And that is, we can get wrapped up in the material world while denying materialism and saying God is more important than material things, spiritual is more important than the material. Yet we can get wrapped up in material things to the point that we begin to infiltrate that into our children by giving them things instead of our time. So let's take the warning of 1 Timothy chapter 6. What do we learn there? All right, some stray from the faith because of greediness. And so greed can cause people to stray from the faith. I can teach my children greed. That causes them to stray from the faith if they ever get in the faith. What is the other passage? Mark 4. We normally cite Luke's account or Matthew's account. Mark's account of this is in the parable of sower. Yeah, the cares of the world choke things out to the point that it is not, the word is not fruitful. Make sense? All right, our author gives this quote from Mark Twain. He said, we're always too busy for our children. We never give them time or interest they deserve. We lavish gifts upon them, but the most precious gift, our personal association, which means so much to them, we give grudgingly. We don't mind giving them money. We don't mind buying them things. But sometimes the very thing they need the most is just our time. They're not interested in material things. They want our attention, and we give that grudgingly. Make sense? Yeah, we do sometimes give serpents and stones to our children. Page 65. Let's go to the second point. Sometimes our children are asking for discipline. Now, our author doesn't mean by that, nor have you experienced that, Not often do children come and say, you know what, I need a spanking. I need to be disciplined. Would you please do that? But children do cry out for that restriction. James Dobson makes this point. We don't have this in our material today, but James Dobson talks about, and we've dealt with this previously, that children look for boundaries and they feel protected by having boundaries. And so sometimes they're hitting that boundary is just a test to see if it's still there. And so they hit against this boundary and yeah, it's still there. So that makes them feel comfortable. I'm being protected by this boundary. Somebody cares enough about me to put boundaries around me and won't let me go beyond those boundaries. And you say, well, they keep hitting the wall. Sometimes they're just testing to see where those boundaries are. All right. So they do ask for discipline in that sense. Proper discipline includes instruction and correction. So we're not just talking about spanking. We're talking about instruction that leads to good behavior. And if that good behavior doesn't come, then the discipline or correction comes later. But I'm more interested in these statements. Absent parents don't discipline well. What do I mean by absent parents? All right, they may be emotionally absent or may just not be paying attention to them. We'll come back to that a little bit later. I'm not talking about where maybe, and this could be included though, the parent that's left the home and maybe in a divorce, but I'm more interested in the fact here, the parent who's hardly ever with their children. They hardly spend any time with their children, whether it be they're at home or they're always gone on the job or they're always doing other things. They have their hobbies, their interests, whatever. They hardly spend any time. If they're absent, they can't discipline much. Well, that's pretty obvious. But sometimes because of that absence, they hesitate to discipline. What would we mean by that?
I don't want to be the bad guy. It's hard to be in that position. And if you feel guilty already, back to the guilt thing, for not being there, you don't want your kid to be mad at you, or you don't want,
Yeah. So maybe they've spent most of the time, I'm going to exaggerate for emphasis, they spent most of their time with their grandparents or maybe with the daycare. And so when I go pick them up, they're misbehaving. I don't want to discipline them now because I want to be the good guy. I don't want to be the one. And so they have, again, a lack of discipline. That's all we're driving at here. Now, I'm not going to spend any time with 1 Samuel 3, not because it's not important. We've already hit this in previous studies 2 or 3 times. Eli's sons were corrupt. You saw that in chapter 2. You see that in chapter 3. And why was that? He did not restrain them. There wasn't this restricting and restraining and discipline and correcting them. So the point here is troubles lie ahead for you if discipline is not exercised. If you're not exercising discipline in your home, you say, I don't have things under control, and I'm just not there enough, and so I hate to do that. Mark it down. You're headed for troubles. You're headed for troubles. There's going to be troubles down the line. There's heartaches down the line. And you say, I don't want heartaches. I hate to be the prophet that tells you you've got heartaches ahead, but you do have heartaches ahead. Make sense? All right.
that's why God's plan has 2 people. It is hard to be the disciplinarian, and sometimes you don't have the resources, the energy, or whatever, and that's where you need the tag team. That's where you need the other person. There's a reason why God has set it up that way.
All right.
One person can't always make the right choices and decisions and do the right thing.
Good point. Children need to be taught before they're disciplined. I'm not going to spend time with Deuteronomy 6. By the way, Deuteronomy 11, we cite Deuteronomy 6 all the time. Deuteronomy 7 repeats that principle again. Same principle. You teach these to your children when you walk, by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up, etc. I'm more interested in this. Let's turn to Deuteronomy 5:16 for a moment. Deuteronomy 5:16. And this principle is found throughout. God not only wanted the children of Israel to teach their children the law, but he wanted them to teach their children to obey. If somebody has it, what does Deuteronomy 5:16 say?
Honor your father and mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you belong, and will dwell with you in the land which the Lord God gives to you.
All right. Now, I'm not going to take the time to read Deuteronomy 21. That just says, honor your father and mother, teach your children to obey is what I'm learning from that. Deuteronomy 21, as the children got older and got rebellious, and they wouldn't be obedient, they were to bring them and basically deliver them to the judges so that they would be stoned. Remember that? Which shows how severe God thought obedience should be. Now, parents need to teach their children about God and about Christ and about salvation. I want to jump to, in interest of time, to point 2 there. Our goal should be for our children to walk in truth. What was said in 3 John 4, or if you didn't go far enough in your 2 John verse 4 there says the same thing essentially. That there's no greater joy. Yeah, knowing my children walk in truth. There's no greater joy than to see your children walk in truth. So that's your goal as a parent. I want my child to walk in truth. I want my child to be walking in harmony with God. That's our goal. We need to teach them, and that's part of this discipline. Now, I want to only look at one of these. Let's go to 13 and 24 of Proverbs. Here's the point, then we'll read the verse. Parents who refuse corrective discipline. I'm just not going to do that. I don't want to be the bad guy. I'm not interested, whatever reason. They refuse to do that. Would you agree they don't love their children? Though they say they do. Yeah, I agree with that too. What does Proverbs 13:24 say? If he loves him, he disciplines him diligently. Yeah. One of these others, Proverbs 22:15, talks about the child will bring shame to their parents because of the lack of discipline. So if you're interested in, and that shows that you don't really care. So if you're interested in loving your child, you're going to show that by the discipline that you exercise. Now, this is another point we want to add before we leave this. Often parents ignore or tune out the child's misbehavior. You agree with that? Now, we're not talking about an absent parent who's not there all the time. They may be right there with them. But they tune out the child's misbehavior or they ignore it. It may become obvious to others, but the parent takes no notice. You ever see that? Maybe that could happen with me as a parent. Maybe that could happen with you as a parent. So take note of that. Am I ignoring, have I learned to tune out my child who's misbehaving so that when I'm around others take notice of my child misbehaving, but I didn't see it at all because I've just learned to tune that out. So children are crying out for discipline. Don't give them a snake or a serpent. Point number 3, page 65. They ask for guidance and we leave them unrestricted. Well, what's this about? Well, our author makes the point that immoral influences are all around. You're raising a child in a society that is flooded with immoral influences, whether it be in fashion, recreation, entertainment, or television, or movies, or music, or internet, or books that's just exuding filth, spewing filth out. And you're raising your child in an environment where all this is going on. So what's our job as parents? We're going to try to build a wall around that. Not that they're sheltered completely from the world, but we're trying to build a spiritual strong wall, a spiritual wall of faith that protects them from that. More about that in a second. Entertainment reflects the morals of our society. Let's go to 1 Peter 4, verses 1 to 4. Worldly entertainment often reflects the morals of our society. Here's the point from 1 Peter 4. The world is different than we are. Would you agree with that? That ought to be the case anyway. All right. What do you see in 1 Peter 4? We won't read the whole text. Notice at verse 2 that he should no longer live the rest of the time in the flesh and the lust of men, but for the will of God. For we've spent enough of our past lifetime walking in lewdness and lust and drunkenness and revelries, etc., abominable idolatries. This is how the world lives. But I'm interested in verse 4. In regard to these, they think it strange. Why do they think it's strange? That you don't take part, that you don't run with them with the same flood of dissipation speaking evil of you. But they're going to speak evil of you and ridicule you for being the bad guy because you don't participate in the things they do, which is sinful. So have a different mindset. That's the point we're driving at. That's the point we're trying to make. So entertainment reflects what our society, the morals of our society. Now let's take a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Christians must rise above the profane and they have to be holy. Let's go to 2 Corinthians 6:14. Think of this passage in the context of raising children. This is not even talking about marriage. You say, well, this is talking about marriage. That's not talking about marriage. Not at all. Be not unequally yoked together with the unbelievers. It's not talking about marriage. It's talking about your relationship to the world. Don't be unequally yoked together with the unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness, and what communion has light with darkness? In other words, we have nothing to do with it. That's not us. We don't agree with that. Now look at verse 1 of verse 17. Come out from among them and be ye separate, he said. And then in verse 1 of chapter 7, that we should be perfecting holiness in the fear of God. In other words, we need to rise above that. And one more point before we leave that Christians, that parents need to respect the divine boundaries of decency. In the rearing and the raising of our children, we need to look to God's Word and find where the boundaries of decency are and draw those for our children and make sure they see that boundary. Make sense? All right. So so back to that point, they ask for guidance and direction, and we don't need to leave them unrestricted. You can go anywhere you want to go to any movie you want to see, listen to whatever music you want to listen to. That's leaving them unrestricted. All right, let's go further. Page 65 still. They ask for spiritual focus, and we give them pleasure. How so? Well, let's start where we need to be. Parents need to direct their children, get their minds focused toward God and toward God's will. Ephesians 6 says, bring your child up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Yes. We need to teach them to set their affections on things that are above. Colossians 3:2. Matthew 6. They need to have this focus toward spiritual things. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. So here's the kind of questions we need to ask. As we allow our children to do things, as we're letting them have association with friends, or we look at things that are influencing our children, we need to ask, is this moral? Does it help them or hinder their faithfulness? Is my child being taught all they need to know? Does this help or hinder their worship? Does it hinder their influence as a Christian? Is God going to be pleased? We need to be interested in spiritual things. We need to teach them to live for heaven. Let's go to, we don't have time to deal with everything here. Let's go to Matthew chapter 6. What do you learn in Matthew 6:19-21? In light of this, you need to teach your child to live for heaven, not for the here and the now. Everything here and now, be it our health, be it our job, be it our money, is all temporary, helping us get ready for heaven. That's the mindset we need to teach our children. So what do we learn from Matthew 6 about that? Sermon on the Mount. Yeah. Do not lay up treasures on earth where moth corrupts and thieves break through and steal. That's all useless and worthless, and you can't depend on it. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. It's in the context of covetousness, materialism, and even worry is in the context. Make sense? Absolutely. All right, 2 points to go, 5 minutes. Let's see if we can do it. Children ask for praise, page 66 now. Children ask for praise and we give them criticism. That's a way of giving them stones or serpents. So what do we mean by that? Well, some parents have unrealistic expectations. And their intent and their mindset may be, I want what's best for my child. So they constantly criticize the child. They're constantly trying to tell the child they can do better. They need to do better. They're not doing good enough yet. And that breaks the spirit of the child. Let's go to Colossians 3:21. It provokes him to wrath. How so? Fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath. How could we provoke them to wrath? Why try? Why try at all? Exactly. Yeah. And so it may be in school, well, you did good, but not even telling them they did good, you can do better. And they do better, well, you can do even better. And it's like I never do well enough. A child constantly criticized is going to end up resenting their parents more so than excelling in other areas. Let me give you some evidence of that. A child, or we'll come to that in a moment, hopefully if time permits. The child loses all respect for parents who criticize them more than they commend or praise. We're not saying don't ever criticize your child. Don't ever condemn your child. But listen to this statement. A child loses respect for the parent who criticizes more than they commend or praise. Would you agree with that? Yes. I like a yes. Yeah. Children need to be reinforced with praise and encouragement and trust. Why? Yeah. They'll want to do more of that behavior that got them that kind of praise, got them that commendation. And then they're more likely to listen to the instruction, Proverbs 3:1. Listen, my son, Proverbs 3:1. Proverbs 4. They're more likely to listen to your encouragement, your instruction, your correction if you'll commend once in a while, rather than constantly tear down. I'm thankful I was raised in a home with parents that when I started my feeble efforts at preaching, encouraged that rather than constantly telling me I could do better. Looking back at some of those early recordings, oh yeah, I could have done a lot better. But it was probably the best I could do at 15, you know? At 15, you're not going to be what you are at 65. And they knew that. And you remember that with your children. Whatever they're attempting to do, they may try to do that, and they're not going to do what they can do 10 years later, but commend them for what they're doing now, rather than constantly tear them down. Make sense?
Part of our leadership class pulls over into this in that, well, a lot of it does, but in that if you're not getting the instruction and the vision and the teaching back there, then it's easy to fall in the criticism and tell the child it was their fault they didn't achieve when what the child needed was that instruction in the first place. You've got to ask those questions that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Child, so that they can get a sense of knowing how to make choices.
Good point. Good point. All right, let's squeeze this in right here. Page 66. Children ask for stability and we give them chaos. So I'm just going to hit this lightly, not because it is a light point, but we don't have much time to develop much further. But this is one of the things kids want. They want stability in a home where father and mother together and there's a loving relationship. When they're raised in a stable home, children feel safe, they feel loved, and they don't suffer the strain and pressures of family problems. Evidence? I'll be the first witness. I was raised in a home that was stable. That's how I felt. Anybody else raised in a stable home? Feel that way? We have eyewitnesses to the account. That's true. That's a true statement. Children raised in a stable home, they're going to be feeling safe and loved, etc. What divorce and broken homes do is destroy the home. And then what we have, and statistics show we don't have time to give, but children end up blaming themselves for that divorce when they may not have a thing to do with that. Many children go through that. I must have been the problem. And so they go through emotional problems. They go through educational problems, behavior problems. There's increased drug use and premarital sex coming out of that broken home. And so what they want is stability, and we throw them chaos. We gave them snakes. We gave them stones instead. Children are harmed by homes with strife, where they see mom and dad fussing and parents mistreating one another. And the agitation that's developed toward the mate is taken out on the children, and children suffer from all of that. And so we give them chaos. Make sense? We're done.